In this video, we're going to talk about weed tea. Now, I'm talking about tea made with dandelions and quackgrass, not marijuana. Sorry. So what is weed tea? Well, you go around your garden, collect a bunch of weeds, put them in some water, let them ferment for a while, and that stuff is weed tea. People online tell you it's full of nutrients, but is that really true? And that's the question I'd like to ask in this video. So what I've done is I've made some weed tea. I'm going to analyze it and see how many nutrients it really has. And then I'll try to answer the question, is this something gardeners should do? Before I tell you how to make weed tea, let's talk about the information that's floating around on the internet. So this weed tea is very nutritious. In fact, some people say it has so many nutrients in it that you have to dilute it before you apply it to your garden. Now, how much do you dilute that? Well, everyone's got a different formula. Some people dilute it 50-50 with water, others 1 part weed tea and 9 parts water. I've looked at over 10 videos on how to make weed tea. Not one ever analyzed the nutrients in it. They all think it's great, but they have no idea what's in that weed tea. That's a real problem in the gardening world. People say stuff and everybody else believes it. I mean, if this was really that nutritious, why didn't someone actually measure the amount of nitrogen or phosphate in this tea? Then you'd have a number, and then they could say, geez, look at the nitrogen. It's a lot. We have to dilute that before we fertilize our garden. Now, gardeners don't like to do that because that gives them the real information. But we're going to try to do that in this video. All right, so how do you make weed tea? Well, there are numerous formulas out there, but most of them will just use plain garden weeds, put them in tap water, put it in a pail like this, and then let it sit for a period of time. Every once in a while, you stir it. Now you should cover this up so you don't get a lot of rain going in here. And I had this one covered with a piece of wood. But people don't agree on how long you have to ferment this. Some people do it for a few days, other people for a week. Only rarely does someone suggest doing it for longer than a couple weeks. The way you know it's done, according to the internet, is you stir it, and if it stinks, it's done. And I can tell you this is done. This stuff reeks like you wouldn't believe. You know that plugged toilet you have that's been plugged for 6 months? Yeah, well, that's what this smells like. Now, in my case, I left it longer. This has been brewing for a month. I want a really good, strong tea to test. Now, when it's finished, what do the weeds look like? Well, see, this is the question I have. If I can still recognize all the stems and the leaves, and in fact, some of it is growing new leaves here, believe it or not, how can it be full of nutrients? The plant has nutrients in it, and somehow they have to get out of the plant and into the water. That normally happens during the composting process. But at the end of the composting process, you don't recognize the material anymore. It's changed. Because chemically, that plant material has broken down, and all those large organic molecules in the plant have been converted to nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, and other minerals. But that's a slow process. And the one thing I know is that if you can still recognize the plant, there hasn't been a lot of composting done. Now you might think, well, I didn't do it right. Here's a couple very short clips I've taken from other videos that show you the same thing when their process is finished. So how many nutrients are in this weed tea? I'm going to test it using a soil kit I have. And it's going to test for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the macronutrients, and those are the ones we care about most. Nitrogen, in fact, is the most important nutrient. I'm also going to compare this to the fertilizer solution that I use for watering my houseplants, because I know it has nutrients in it. we're also going to compare those two to my tap water. That way I know what nutrients went in here from my tap water. For those who understand the scientific method, that tap water and the fertilizer water are our controls. It'll tell us what is in the water to start with, and then we know how much the weeds have added. And by comparing weeds to the fertilizer, we know that our test kit is working. All that's left is to sample the tea. Now it stinks too much. I can't drink that. I'm going to take this, let the solid material settle out, take off the clear water on top, and then we'll do some testing. For the test, I used the Rappy-Test Soil Test Kit. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why would I use a soil test kit when I'm actually testing water or fertilizer? If you think about it, the soil test kit is really not a soil test kit. What you do is you take the soil, you dissolve it in some water, then you take the water away and measure the water. So you're measuring the amount of nutrients that have dissolved in the water. You don't actually measure the soil directly. So these kits are really water test kits, and they should work just fine for testing a fertilizer solution. Now I'm not going to show you the whole detail of the testing. I've done that in my previous video when I did a product review of the Rappy-Test Soil Test Kit. And if you're interested in the details, have a look at that video. When I reviewed the methods online, I found a variety of different dilutions. Anything from 50-50 up to 1 in 100. But the most common dilutions I found was 1 part weed tea to 4 parts water. And so that's the dilution I used here. Here are the test results for nitrogen. Now there are 3 test containers there. The one on the left is for tap water, one in the middle is the fertilizer I use for my indoor plants, and the one on the right is the weed tea. Now just ignore the caps. Okay, they are color coded for different tests, but I'm not using them that way in this test. What I did here is I put each liquid in a different container, and then I added the chemical all at the same time, put the caps on, and shook them all at the same time, and let them sit for an equal amount of time. That way my comparisons are the same for each nutrient. The nitrogen test produces a nice pink coloration. One of the nice things about this test kit is that there are 2 chambers. The one on the left has the liquid in it and no chemicals are added to it, so it's not changed. If we look at the left chamber for tap water, it's nice and clear. That's what we'd expect. The fertilizer has a slight tinge of green to it, and the weed tea has a kind of a brown coloration. The chemicals are only put in the small chamber on the right side. Now the nice thing about this test kit is that you're able to look at the coloration in comparison to the natural liquid without chemical in it. Now if we look at the results, tap water has no nitrogen, the fertilizer has a fair amount of nitrogen, and the weed tea, well, it's showing no nitrogen at all. And remember, nitrogen is the nutrient that your plants need most. It's probably the nutrient that is deficient in your soil. This is the phosphate test, and the phosphate gives you a nice blue coloration. You can see here that the tap water shows a bit of phosphate, the fertilizer shows a lot of phosphate, and the weed tea is somewhere in between these 2. This slide shows the benefit of doing controls whenever you do this kind of testing in the garden. You can see that my tap water has phosphate in it. That's probably because the water comes from underground here. I'm on a well, and our soil here has a high level of limestone in it. So that limestone is giving us phosphate, and all of the water around here has some phosphate in it. So we now have to subtract that away from what you see on the weed tea. Now if we look at the weed tea, it does show a fair amount of blue, but remember that's a combination of that dark coloration of the natural tea and the phosphate it's getting from tap water. So the amount of actual phosphate in that tea is pretty low. Fertilizer, on the other hand, is quite high, which is what we'd expect from a commercial fertilizer. And by the way, the fertilizer here is Miracle-Gro, and it has an NPK ratio of 3:1:2. What about potassium? Well, the 3 tests show no potassium in any of the samples. Potassium would show up as a nice orange color. Now in the tap water, you do see some coloration there, but that amount of color ends up being 0 on the comparison chart. So even though there's a bit of color there, that's still 0 potassium. Same with the fertilizer and the weed tea. Now this test was kind of unexpected. I mean, I was certain that my fertilizer had potassium in it. So I went back and looked at my old test results when I first evaluated this soil test kit, and actually I had the same results there. For some reason, the potassium test in this soil test just doesn't work. Even when the sample has potassium in it, you still don't get proper coloration. In that previous test, I compared the rapid test results to a lab test, and I know the lab test was correct. My soil has a fairly high level of potassium, and yet the rapid test kit showed none. Again, this illustrates the value of controls. That middle one, the fertilizer, we know it has potassium, and if it doesn't color up correctly, we know there's something wrong with the test kit. If you want to know more about the value of controls and the scientific method, have a look at my blog, and I have an article there called The Scientific Method and Why Controls Are So Important. And the name of that blog is gardenmyths.com. So let's summarize these results. Tap water and weed tea has almost no nitrogen in it. The fertilizer has a high value. For phosphate, tap water and weed tea are very low. The potassium test failed, so we really don't know how much potassium is in any of these samples. But there's no reason to think that either tap water or weed tea would have a high amount of potassium when all of the other nutrients are low. Those results are a little surprising. I mean, the internet tells you this stuff has a lot of nutrients, and we didn't find very many. In fact, almost 0. Why is that? Well, there's a fundamental mistake being made by gardeners. They know that plants contain nutrients, and that is true. They think that when you put it in water and get some green liquid out of this, that all the nutrients are in there, but that's the mistake they're making. Most of the nutrients in plants are tied up in large molecules. Let's look at nitrogen, for instance. It's in protein, which are huge molecules. And until that plant material is completely degraded, that nitrogen stays in there. In fact, even in finished compost, that nitrogen comes out slowly for another 5 years. So although plants have nutrients in it, it doesn't come out very fast, and it's certainly not going to come out after a 2-week brewing process. Now, what does the science say? I looked for studies on weed tea, and I only found one. They looked at 3 different plants, including comfrey, which is supposed to be really nutritious. And they found that all 3 plants gave about the same amount of nutrients. They did find a reasonable amount of nutrients in their brew, but they did the brew a little different than gardeners. So first of all, they brewed for a full month. The longer you brew, the more nutrients you'll get into the water. The second thing they did was they took that plant material and they chopped it up very fine. In effect, they made a mash of the stuff. You know from composting that the smaller the pieces of plant material, the faster they compost. Well, the same is true for making weed tea. You have to get that stuff very fine. A good suggestion for a home gardener would be to put it in the blender. Taking whole weeds or even cutting them up with the scissors is not really going to do very much. The third thing they did was they used a lot of weeds for a small amount of water. You really want to create a kind of a pasty material. By increasing the amount of weeds and decreasing the amount of water, you end up with more nutrients in that water. The nutrients they found were fairly reasonable. I wouldn't call it a high nutrient material, but it did have nutrients in it, and therefore it would be useful for fertilizing plants. Would I make weed tea? And should you make weed tea? Let's have a look at the facts. First of all, it takes a month and a fair amount of work to grind this stuff up. So there's a fair amount of work involved. It also stinks terribly. Now that might not stop you, but quite honestly, I hate that smell. And why does it smell? Well, what happens is a few of the nutrients go in the water and bacteria go into the water. And they start growing, and they're anaerobic. They grow without oxygen because they're in the water. Anaerobic bacteria tend to create smell. It's as simple as that. The smell really doesn't indicate a high level of nutrients. It just means that there are bacteria living in there. And in fact, the bacteria are using up the free nutrients as they grow. And they're incorporating those nutrients into big molecules. So those bacteria are actually your enemy in releasing the nutrients. They're tying it up so it's not available for plants. Now the material would be good for small gardens, potted plants. Maybe if you have one or two small raised beds, it might be worth doing. But if you're trying to fertilize a normal garden like this, you'd have to make an awful lot of weed tea to get enough nutrients in there to make a difference. I have a much better solution. When you're weeding the garden, take these weeds and just throw them back into the garden. Within a day or two, they dry up and you won't see them. Then they'll slowly decompose and add the nutrients into the soil. No work and just as many nutrients as in weed tea. This process is a little slower in releasing those nutrients, but we're talking a month or two slower. Eventually they go into the soil, and quite honestly, no work at all. I won't be making weed tea anytime soon, and most of the information online is wrong. It is not a high nutrient fertilizer. If the person recommending weed tea doesn't test it and show you the values, don't believe them. Now, if you want to learn more about garden myths, have a look at my two books, Garden Myth Book 1 and Garden Myth Book 2, and I'll put a link to those right here. I've also made other videos about garden myths, and that link will be in the top right-hand corner. Happy gardening!